Hi everyone, my name is James, and today I'm going to build a disc sander. This is a 20-inch disc sander, which is something I've been needing for a while to sand the bottoms of the big boxes that we sometimes make. I do have a smaller disc sander that's part of a combination sanding machine that I have, but I don't have anything that's anywhere near 20 inches, and I don't really have $1,500 or $2,000 to drop on a big sander like this. So this is something I put together since I have a lathe, and anybody can do this for probably 20 bucks, and I'll show you how I did it. I had a piece of maple that was about 3 inches thick that I had glued up for another project that I wasn't using, so it's just kind of scrap. You could create a piece that's 2 or 3 inches thick by gluing up some scrap wood and laminating it, and I cut it to a rough square, and I just drew a 6-inch circle around it, and I'm going to cut that out on the bandsaw. It doesn't have to be too perfect. We're going to true it up to perfectly round on the lathe. But the next step here is I'm going to go ahead and screw my faceplate into it. I have a 6-inch faceplate that came with my lathe, and I'm going to attach it to this. If you're thinking of doing this project, I would use hardwood here for this 6-inch round piece. I wouldn't use MDF. You just want something a little bit more secure that's not going to fly apart on the lathe at high speed if it gets under any stress. So that's why I went with maple. And there's the photo bomber sitting across from me sanding a box. So I'll just put this on the lathe here so that I can turn this true. And really just about any lathe would work for this. Some lathes, the headstock will rotate sideways. You'll see me do that here in just a minute. And then I can get a great big disc on there. If your lathe does not, the headstock doesn't rotate 90 degrees sideways, you can still put a sanding disc on it. You might be limited to a 10 or 12-inch disc. But even that's a really good sanding disc, and that's a really good utility tool to have. So once I get the side of it nice and true and perfectly round, I'm going to go ahead and true up the face, just in case it was a little thicker on one side or something like that. That's just going to help me to create a perfect cylinder to go forward with. Then once that is done, I'm going to put my chuck, my drill chuck, into my tailstock. If you don't have a drill chuck for your lathe, you can pick those up pretty cheap on Amazon. I'll put a link to that and everything I used in the description. I think I paid maybe $15 or $20 for this chuck, this drill chuck, and it's pretty handy to have. You can drill things into wood and get things perfectly centered. It's nice for bowl making as well. The next tool I put in here is the all-important tool that makes this work. This is a Spindle Tap. This particular one is a 1x8 spindle tap, so it's 1 inch in diameter and 8 threads per inch. It is designed to perfectly fit the spindle for a lathe. Notice that I started it in the tailstock and got it threaded in about 4 or 5 threads, and then I switched to my ratchet to drive it the rest of the way in. It's important to start it or do as much as you can while it's still attached to the tailstock. That way it stays dead centered and you have a nice, neat, perfectly straight thread. Your spindle might be different than mine. Mine happens to be a 1x8. But they do make these in several different sizes, and I'll put the links actually to a few different sizes. You could have a 7/8 inch spindle or even a 1 or a 1 1/4. It could be anywhere in that range. So I'll put the links to a few of them in there. Just make sure that if you decide to order this, you order the correct one for your size spindle. So once that's done, I'm going to chamfer the entrance to the hole here, because as this block of wood that I have turns around and gets threaded onto my spindle, the very last in part of the spindle actually has no threads. So I just want to make sure that I can clear that as I screw this on. And you obviously want to make sure that you have drilled deep enough and put your threads deep enough so that you can screw this on all the way until it bottoms out on the back of the spindle. Now I can just remove these screws, take my faceplate off, and I can turn the front part of this true. It's basically the same procedure as I did on the back side. Just make sure that it's perfectly flat. You might be able to see in the background there one of the Purple Heart Keepsake boxes that we are working on. When we join these boxes together, sometimes all of the different boards on the top or the bottom don't line up exactly perfectly. And in the past, I've created a big flat sanding block with 4 sheets of sandpaper on it to just sand the top of the box on that. And by creating this sanding disc here, I'm going to minimize the amount of time that I have to spend on sanding like that. Yeah, I can do in just a few seconds what used to take me maybe half an hour by hand. Here I'm just going to sand it a little bit with some 80 grit paper to rough up the surface a tiny bit so that I can get a good glue joint with epoxy between this and the disc that I'm going to use. And so I bought a 3-pack of 20-inch sanding discs from Amazon. So I'm actually tracing this onto a piece of 1.5 inch thick MDF. This was from a project, a piece that I had left over, and this is really big, beefy stuff. I think if you're going to make one of these sanding discs, the disc itself should be pretty thick. You could glue up a couple of sheets of 3/4 inch plywood or a couple of sheets of 3/4 inch MDF. You could probably even get away with 2 1/2-inch sheets of MDF, but you want something that's got a little bit of mass to it, something that's going to stay flat. So if it's laminated, that'll help out. So my daughter Maya is going to cut it out for me, and she's going to cut it maybe between 1/4 and 1/2 inch big, and I'll go ahead and I'll turn it down to perfectly round. What I'm doing here is I don't really have any idea exactly where the center is because I had to turn the piece over and remark my line. And so I'm just taking my compass and going slightly past the halfway point and just holding on various parts of the circle and drawing lines, and that'll kind of give me a clue as to where the center of the circle actually is. Next I'm going to draw a few rings. I'm not sure exactly what size my turned down piece ended up being, so I'll draw a few rings, 2 or 3 different sizes, which will kind of give me some concentric circles, and I'll be able to glue my block right into the middle of these and kind of get a good feel for making sure that it's as close to center as possible. We are going to go ahead and use 5-minute epoxy because I want to use this thing today. My daughter Sai is going to mix up the epoxy for us. If you had time to wait, you could certainly use Titebond glue on the joint and just let it sit overnight. Case Western Reserve University did a study and actually showed that Titebond glue forms a stronger bond with wood than epoxy does. We just want to get a good coat to thoroughly cover all of the surfaces of the wood here. And then I'm just going to place it down and visually sight it to be as close to center as possible. I know all of those rings are perfect, have their focal points right at the center of my disc here, and so I'll just kind of center this between a couple rings. I'm going to kind of press it and rub it in a little bit first to make sure that glue makes a really good secure bond. And then once I get it centered to where I like it, I'm going to put some weights on it. I've got a big 20 or 25 pound giant 4-inch nut I'm going to use as a gravity clamp to hold this in place. And so now I just have to goof off for about 5 minutes while that epoxy sets up. Hey, check those sweet boxes in the background over there. Here's what I was talking about earlier. A lot of lathes will have the headstock that rotates so that you don't have to keep it directly over the bed. You can rotate it out to the front or even the side, the back end of the lathe, and you can put a much bigger sanding disc on it this way, which is what we decided to do. So now what I want to do is I'm actually going to put some screws in this, and I've decided this is how I'm going to have to mark the center. So I'm just going to draw an X basically across the center here. And this is going to help me get some screws equally placed so that the weight stays balanced. I know that stray round circular line there on the front is throwing us all off, but hopefully we can just ignore that. So size, making a mark about 2.5 or 3 inches out from the center. And where that round circle touches the 4 points of the X, that's where I'm going to put screws in. Now that way I know these things are centered, so the weight is going to be balanced. I imagine that the epoxy bond is probably plenty strong, but I don't want to take any chances of this thing possibly flying off at some point, so I thought the screws would be just a little added measure of security. And now I'm just going to turn the side of it back to a perfect circle. And you have to wear a mask for sure when turning or sanding MDF. This stuff just creates a ton of horrible dust. And obviously our attempt to vacuum it up was a complete failure there. So I'm just going to smooth over the edges, make sure there's no rough spots or sharp corners. And then I'm going to go ahead and sand the front. The front is perfectly true. We tested it, and as it should be, since the block behind it was. And so I'm just going to sand it really finely with some 220 then 320 grit, so we have a nice smooth surface on the face of it. And once I clean that off with a little bit of tack cloth and get all of the sawdust off of it completely, it will be a nice surface in order for me to stick the pressure sensitive adhesive disc to. And Sai is going to help me do this here, so hopefully we can get it dead center. The cool thing about building this system is I can build 3 or 4 of these sanding discs with the blocks attached in the back, and I can just keep different grits on each one, and it just takes a couple of seconds to swap out from one grit to the next, because I'm essentially just swapping out the entire sanding block. So once we get it in place, we'll just kind of press it down uniformly everywhere. And then I like to run the eraser block over the whole thing, which gives nice, good, firm, even pressure while it's spinning, and that makes sure that we are securely stuck down. And then I'm ready for a quick test. This is one of my 10-inch by 15-inch Keepsake boxes, and the bottom was not even, and I also had to sand down the maple to get it flush with the surface, and it actually just took maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and the whole thing is sanded down nice and flush. I would follow that with finer grits with my random orbit sander, because the disc sander essentially is just a tool to remove a lot of stock and get things flush. And I did a couple of tests on some smaller size boxes that were in process as well. I think overall I am pretty pleased with this disc sander. So if you have a lathe, that's really all there is to it, to building your own 20-inch disc sander. Thanks for watching.